So it's a particular pleasure for me to talk about Anna Mani, who was a physicist exemplar and a pioneering climate scientist of India. And it's particularly nice for me to talk about her because it brings to me a lot of nostalgia. I knew her when I was a very young PhD student, and she was an amazing inspiration. I would like to thank Krishna as we call him, who was formerly with the Raman Research Institute, the library of the Raman Research Institute, Nandita Jairaj, who's a science communicator with the Life of Science Feminist Journalist Collective, and Abha Sur, who is a scientist and feminist scholar at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I just wanted to start with a couple of quotes of Anna Mani, which kind of give you a sense of her persona. So she said, "We have only one life. First, equip yourself for the job, make full use of your talents, and then love and enjoy the work, making the most of being out of doors and in contact with." She would keep saying this: wrong measurements are worse than no measurements. That's, of course, why we call her a physicist exemplar. So Anna Mani was born about 104 years ago. She grew up in Pirmade in Kerala, where her early life and education happened. She did PhD research. This is a mistake. She did PhD research with C.V. Raman, but at the Indian Institute of Science, sorry, not the Raman Institute. She was a pioneering Indian physicist and meteorologist. She started her career right after independence, and she carried out path-breaking research. So it is important to remember the climate in which such people shaped their lives. So she was born at a time when women's literacy in the country was barely 1%. She was born a mere 6 decades after Fatima Sheikh and Savitribai Phule started the first school in which everyone was meant to be included. Women and people from lower castes were meant to be included. And it's a different story about the kind of struggles that they had to undergo in order to bring that about. And so this is a quote, I think it is by Abha Sur, I'm not 100% sure, which says that systemic failures still allow selective successes that belie probabilities. And Anna Mani was an example of that. So she had a father who always taught her to question everything, she said. Her education was nearly free for everyone at that time. She grew up in the state of Travancore, and they had such a policy for education. She grew up during the national struggle. She was heavily inspired by the Vaikom struggle against caste oppression. And Gandhi visited her neighborhood when she was 7 or something like that. And she was hugely inspired by him. A few years later, as a young woman, she witnessed the fact that Sarojini Naidu became the president of the Congress. And so that kind of politicization, no doubt, builds a huge cultural capital, which does explain why there are these exceptions in the face of systemic failures. And of course, this was heightened by the climate of the time with a strong nationalistic and egalitarian framework. And she remained a Gandhian and egalitarian all her life. And this kind of mindset very clearly shaped her science practice as well. So this is a photograph, an early photograph when she joined the Indian Institute of Science for PhD. So she did her undergraduate education in Madras and graduated with flying colors in physics and chemistry, which then gave her a scholarship to do her graduate study at the Indian Institute of Science. And these are a couple of photographs from that time. So she investigated fluorescence and absorption at visible frequencies of diamonds. She looked at 32 species of diamonds. So Raman had this huge collection of diamonds, and those are what she studied. And she studied their optical properties by putting the specimens at liquid air temperatures, because her predecessor, somebody called Nair, had done similar work and determined that the features showed up with high clarity when they put the specimens at liquid air temperatures. She looked at the geometric luminescence patterns in the cleavage plates of diamonds, and the dependence of luminescence on frequency, and the state of polarization also of Raman scattering. So she says that until about that time, it was sort of the general impression that the luminescence of diamonds had to do with impurities, and the research didn't advance very much. But then there were all these other properties that came to light, and that was the motivation for this extensive study. She found two kinds of luminescence in diamonds, an electronic associated emission at 405 nanometers and another one at 503 nanometers. And both of these were accompanied by subsidiary lower frequency radiation. And the variation in intensities of the above corresponded with differences in associated absorption spectra. And she also found several new electronic transitions and variation in the fine structure of the 415 nanometer feature across diamonds, meaning across different specimens. And also the Raman scattering and blue luminescence apparently showed anomalous polarization characteristics. So these are a couple of diagrams from her PhD thesis. And this is a sequence which shows, I mean, the figure caption says that it shows progressive change in the relative intensities of the 415 and 503 nanometer systems. And she says, notice also the changes in the appearance of the 415 nanometer line. So this is that PhD thesis, and it sits in the Raman Institute library. But the story ahead of this is not very nice. Firstly, while a PhD student, so I don't know if you know the history of the, shall we say, experience of women PhD students in physics. So when C.V. Raman was the director of the Indian Institute of Science, one year the topper from Bombay University, whose name was Kamla Bhagwat, applied to do a PhD in the Indian Institute of Science, and Raman said, I will not have any girls in my institute. And Kamla Bhagwat was no pushover, so she used her senior colleagues to put some sort of pressure. She herself went on a sort of dharna, and in the end, Raman did admit her, but under very humiliating conditions. And so near the end of her life, she has gone on record about this, that she, in her written sort of admission letter, had very humiliating conditions attached to her admission. The nice part of it was that she found a very good supervisor to supervise her work. And then she went on to do amazing work. She did a PhD in Cambridge, and then she came back to India and did all kinds of amazing things. So in a way, she opened the door for women to enter the Indian Institute of Science. And so when, at the time that Anna Mani got her admission, there were three women who went to do physics graduate study, Lalita Doraiswamy, Anna Mani, and Sunanda Bai. And Lalita Doraiswamy, later to become Lalita Chandrasekhar, sort of left her research halfway to go with her spouse to the United States. Anna Mani and Sunanda Bai did very, very good work in their PhD. But Raman had this policy. So Anna Mani and Sunanda Bai worked with Raman because they were doing PhDs in physics. So he had a policy of gender segregation in the lab. So the women were not allowed, these two women, they were not allowed to interact with any of the men colleagues around them. So she was completely deprived of the intellectual discourse that, we all as PhD students take for granted, attending seminars and discussing with the speakers afterwards and going for dinner with them and whatever else. And even the day-to-day interaction with our peers, sharing both what happened to our experiments as well as what happens in life. She has talked about how aspersions were constantly being cast as to only unmarried women get to do PhDs with Raman and things like that. I mean, Anamani was single. Sunanabai actually officially was not single, but for some reason, people didn't know that she was not. And so they cast all these aspersions, and they had very carefully chosen epithets, disparaging epithets, of course, to describe the women students. The kind of work that they were doing, the kind of sources they had were very feeble. So they didn't have access to lasers and things like that. And therefore, the exposures that they needed to do were very, very long. So like 15 hours kind of exposures. And so they had to spend all this time in the lab. And they've talked about how on the grass or wherever, whereas they felt constrained to crawl under their work tables in the lab and take rest. And so it wasn't a level playing field at all. Anyway, the research that I just described earlier, based on that, she published 5 single author papers, but she was denied her PhD. So she submitted her PhD to Madras University, and they denied the PhD on grounds that she did not have a master's. And this was despite the fact that she had actually, after her BSc in a college in Madras, got a scholarship to study for graduate study, which she used to go to the Indian Institute of Science and work with Raman. But despite that, she was denied the PhD. I thought that was the end of that. But while I was researching a little bit for this talk, I discovered that she also had a master's thesis, which is here. And this is work, it's called Thesis, it's called Optical and Magnetic Studies of Ruby. So apart from diamonds, she also studied ruby. And it says this: the thesis submitted to the University of Madras for the degree of Master in Science. So I have no idea what happened to this. I've asked around. I haven't got a clear answer. This is something that Krishna sent to me, which is like a CV that she wrote a few years later. And here she says, associateship of the Indian Institute of Science on presentation of a thesis on the fluorescence and absorption data of ruby. I don't know, it doesn't all fit together. So I don't know what this mystery is about a master's, what happened to it. And it was submitted to the University of Madras because that's what it says. Somebody told me she did get the master, but then if she got the master, then why she not got a PhD? So I don't know what happened with all of that, but basically she didn't get a PhD. Then won a scholarship to study in England, and she plunged into climate science. That's what she got the scholarship for. She hesitated a lot to accept the scholarship because, these were colonial times, and her sort of patriotism initially did not allow her to accept a fellowship from the British. But then people told her that, well, it's actually our money. I mean, they may be giving it to you, but the money is ours. So there's no problem when you're taking it. And so then she did take it and she did go. She got a lot of experience in multiple laboratories doing climate science. She did not get shackled by the institution of marriage. She had very low regard, it's very clear, for the institution of marriage. And so then she came back in 1948 to a position at the Indian Meteorological Department. And there she did amazing work. So this is a photograph of hers with a radio sound. So they built all these things. I mean, radio sounds are these meteorological instruments which they fly up in balloons, and they take data on the weather, on pressure, this, that, and the other, and transmit the data through radio telemetry back to the ground. And a very, very important thing she did was to build an ozone sun. So this was the time when it was beginning to be realized that ozone was a serious climate problem. and that the ozone layer, this business about the ozone layer hole and all of that. And so it was important to make measurements of ozone. People started building ozone sondes, which are basically ozone measuring equipment, which are flown up in a balloon. And they're basically a radio sonde with a additional thing to measure ozone. The ozone sonde has an air pump which bubbles ambient air into a sensor cell. And then the ozone in that ambient air reacts with the potassium iodide in the sensor cell. And the generated electrical signal measures the amount of ozone. So this is coupled with a normal radio sonde on a balloon. The data are then telemetered down, and the samples are taken over a period of about 2 hours, and the height sample are about 0 to 35 kilometers. So India became one of 5 countries in the world to build their own ozone sonde. So that was like a very, very important achievement, and it put India on the world map in the ozone investigation, and she was made a member of the International Ozone Commission. This is a photograph of Annamani at one of the World Meteorological Organization meetings in Switzerland. She also played a key role in the first rocket launch that India did. Vikram Sarabhai, who was driving that effort, asked her to build a meteorological observatory at Tumba, which was the launch site in Kerala, which she did with all the necessary equipment on towers and so on and so forth. This is a picture, I think it's a picture taken in the Raman Institute, but I think this was from around this time. Just looking. I mean, I just gave a few snippets of the kind of things she did while working for the meteorological department. It was a major effort. She rose to quite a leadership position. She was instrumental in refurbishing, not just refurbishing their workshops so that they could build equipment, but also emphasizing and working towards the importance of standards, because unless these instruments are calibrated to proper standards, the measurements are not meaningful. Remember the quote, her earlier quote, that wrong measurements, no measurements are better than wrong measurements. So it was a huge effort in terms of standardizing these measurements on a national scale. That was all part of it. Also, the whole, patriotic favor and self-reliance and all of that. So a lot of equipment, she enabled them to be made in India. She had very, very rigorous training in both the physics of these measuring things and also the practicalities of implementing them. And so there's a long list of instruments which started to be made in India thanks to her. She retired from the Indian Meteorological Department as Deputy Director General in 1976. And then she came to Bengaluru to become a Emeritus Professor not Emeritus Professor, but I don't know what her position was, but Emeritus something for 3 years. And during that time, she championed the national effort to get into alternate energy methods. So she realized that in order to actually adopt alternative energy sources, there was a need to measure and understand the distribution of both solar radiation and wind across the country under different topographical conditions, seasonal conditions, etc., etc. So she produced these books. So solar radiation all over India, and then this handbook of solar radiation. So these were much referenced, very basic handbooks that she prepared. These were, I think, commissioned by the Department of Science and Technology. But she also collaborated with the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology in order to do a similar thing for wind all across the country. And at that time, building of hardware was not that common, whether in public enterprises or much less in private ones. So she actually started an enterprise for instruments. And obviously, she started the enterprise not to make money, but to actually build the instruments because the country needed them. That's sort of a few snippets from a very, very illustrious career that Annamani led. I think it was last year I had done a Facebook post on the occasion of her birthday where I talked about her PhD work and how she was denied a PhD. I was a young PhD student at the time that she came to at that time that she was hanging around in the Raman Institute doing all this work with wind energy and so on and so forth. And I didn't have any academic connection with her as such, but because the astrophysics group in TIFR, which was on the ISC campus, and Raman Institute had a small astrophysics group and all that. So we used to sort of hang out a lot. I used to spend a lot of time at the Raman Institute. And so I would encounter her a lot. For me, it was really, really special because on the one hand, she was a quintessential scientist. I mean, she had science written all over her. That's the only way I can describe her. And she was one of a handful of people who treated me just as a science student instead of, most others treated me as a woman first, which was very, very oppressive at the time because there were not that many women around. And so it was very oppressive to have this thing highlighted all the time. And she was such a refreshing change from that. She had this no-nonsense persona. She was clad in khadi a lot of the time, and she would just walk into the room and always have something non-trivial to say. I mean, looking back now on those times, she was a very strong presence for me, there is this whole thing that you come into science with this sort of romantic idea of what science is and what scientific research is. And then you find that, it's mostly that sort of idea is not realized somehow. On the other hand, she was one person who upheld that idea. And to me, she embodied that idea. So it was really amazing for me. One thing I did used to cringe a lot at that time is that for some reason, I mean, she became Academy Fellow, she had all these high positions. For some reason, she would not be addressed as Professor Mani. I mean, I understand she would not be Dr. Mani because she didn't have a PhD, but she would not even be addressed as Professor Mani. And if I said, Mani or Anna Mani, and people say, who? And then say, oh, you mean Miss Mani. So this Miss Mani was how everybody referred to, as if Miss was her first name or something. And I used to cringe at it because I used to feel that there was this need for everyone to firstly emphasize her singlehood and secondly emphasize the fact that she didn't have a PhD. And it didn't make any sense to me. But I saw this a lot. I mean, everywhere she would be called Miss Ma. I posted this thing about her, about how amazing she was and how she was denied a PhD and all that on Facebook. And one of the responses I got, I don't think I know that person, but that person said, how about granting the PhD now? I was thinking about this, and I think it is important to do gestures like this in order to make clear that it's about setting a wrong right. I mean, it's not going to make a difference to Annamani, obviously, but at least it will be an acknowledgement that wrong things happen by institutions and they need to be corrected. So it would be a statement. I wanted to also draw attention to how we honor the work of scientists in the past, particularly women scientists. So I'm sure all of you know about Vigyan Prasar. They are a DST-funded institution for science communication located in Delhi, here. And they made a documentary on Annamani in 2016. This is what it's called, Weathering Heights with Miss Annamani. For some reason, again, they want to emphasize the miss. And I was a little amazed to see some of the things written there. So for instance, it has a quote. This is a quote from the film, which says, Professor C.V. Raman offered her the opportunity to join him in his continuing research on fluorescence, an unthinkable privilege for a woman at the time. And I was really stunned by this because, why would you say it's an unthinkable privilege? She excelled in her BSc and she had a scholarship. And so, I mean, if I were an academic and a student with that kind of credentials came to me, I would be thrilled that, that student is choosing to work with me. So I don't understand how it's a privilege for her. Then they talk about, on a war footing, Anna trained a core group of experts that could design, manufacture, calibrate, et cetera, instruments at the IMD, a period considered most exciting, et cetera. And it says the department was a hive that hummed with activity around Anna, the queen bee. Again, these very I don't know what to call them. I mean, at best, sexist descriptions. And here's another one. Promoted to head the instrumentation division of IMD of 121 men, an unusual achievement for a woman at the time. She was just promoted to that position because she qualified and met the requirements of that position, period. I mean, the fact that all the 121 staff were men is actually a very poor reflection on the department. And, how is it an achievement from her side that she's heading 121 men? The achievement is what she has done, the work she has done, and the insights she had and the foresights she had and so on. Again, Miss Anna Mani can well be described as the mother of India's weather instruments. I mean, again, she had very little respect and regard for the institution of marriage. This is very clear from the statement that she makes. And so it's a particularly double whammy to, use descriptions like that. So I think that it is really important to honor women scientists of the past for the outstanding work that they did. Often it was head and shoulders above the average. And I mean, it just so happens that the average is determined until now mostly by men. But it is important to consciously and deliberately step away from this business of, that was not bad for a woman kind of trope, which we encounter all the time. That's a Sidney Harris cartoon. I forgot to put the credit. On the other side, the nice thing is that Google did a doodle for her this year, talked about all her achievements. There is a comic book about her written by Nandita Jayaraj from the Life of Science Collective and illustrated by Priya Kurian. Published by Pratham Books, and the soft copy is downloadable for free. And there's a very nice YouTube video that describes why Nandita chose Anna Mani in particular to do this comic book. This is another page out of that comic book. Nandita says, when I'm interacting with school children, I always start off my talk by asking them, can you name 3 women scientists from India for me? And invariably, there is a long pause after Kalpana Chawla. Of course, she goes on to say, this is not because there are no women scientists in India. There have been many, many who've done remarkable work, etc., etc. That's where we are. I want to end just by advertising the Anna Mani Memorial Lectures, which have been instituted by the Working Group for Gender Equity of the Astronomical Society of India. I was really happy to be part of the group that started this series. And the idea is to bring speakers from other disciplines into our forum to talk about gender inequity in astrophysics or physics or whatever. And so all of these lectures are on YouTube and are available. These are some of the past lectures, and that series is still continuing. So I would strongly recommend. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Prajval. Wow, what a nice, encouraging talk. So now the talk is open for questions. I think I will not say it's a question. I will consider it as a discussion. So discussion.
Like, how has it changed in the last like several years? When did it become much better, and to like how is it right now? Like I'm sure there's still some sort of um unfortunately discrimination, or is it like still like is it become much better?
Okay, so some things have changed. For instance, even scientists younger than me, so I mean, I'm almost 65. Scientists younger than me have been told about how, they're biologically not suited to do science, etc., by people in the profession, meaning like senior professors and all that. So I think now the generation of young scientists uh, at least won't hear that, not because people don't think it, but at least the senior people know not to say it. They realize it's not the right thing to say. So there are a couple of things like that which have improved. There is a mandated sexual harassment policy that the government mandate. I mean, it's the law of the land, not the government. It's the law of the land now. That could be something that could be used as a means to increase awareness and all that. However, I would like to say that I can't claim that it has been a success the way it was meant to be. I showed a whole pile of data at my talk days ago here, which may not be recorded, I guess, but where it is very clear. So it's not at all true that there is no discrimination anymore. We have a very, very long way to go. Symptoms are not simply numbers. So the symptoms are many more than that. And the unfortunate part is, on the one hand, there is very little acknowledgement. So there is acknowledgement that there is a gender gap, which means that there are fewer women than men. But that you can't deny because that is like in your face. Where there is not acknowledgement is that this is because of discrimination within the profession. So there is very, very little acknowledgement. And so therefore, all the interventions which are designed, they also come from this very patriarchal mindset. In that talk of mine, I looked at various explanations as to why there are fewer women than men in science. One of them is that there is no interest in science among girls. The evidence completely contravenes that. So that's not a problem. People say women are socialized to think that they are incompetent in science. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence of that, more and more now. In fact, just the other day, we were having chai together, and it was clear so many young people have faced this, whereas I did not face it. As a young, I went to a girls' school, a girls' college. It was a very ordinary school. I went to Kannada medium the first 7 years, and all my teachers except music, dance, and Kannada were women. And they were all, lower middle class women for whom this was a very strong livelihood. But nevertheless, they were very dedicated teachers. And I never heard any of them say to us, this subject is okay for you and this is not okay for you. Never, ever. Not in college either. Whereas now I hear so many people telling me, whether it's in IIT coaching classes or in school or in college, or we were sitting at the table and two people said that they had been told this. Two women said that they had been told this. So there is a regression as well. However, that is not the statistics don't show that is the driver of the gender gap. And the other thing that, of course, everybody says is that women, there's a social discriminatory responsibility on women to carry out household responsibilities. And that is the reason for the gender. Again, there's no question that there is discriminatory societal expectations, but that is not, the data don't support the idea that that is the reason for the gender gap. Because even though women face discriminatory responsibilities, there is no productivity deficit when they are in scientific institutions, and there is no reduction in working hours. There is no qualification deficit either. It's not like women the women who are there are have lower qualification. It's actually the other way around. The data show the other way around. So although it's true that there is discriminatory familial responsibilities on women, that does not show up in the productivity. So it looks like women somehow manage, or maybe some of the men are out to lunch or whatever. So, it kind of evens out. So the main reason is discrimination with the profession. As we speak, there are women who are disqualified from applying for faculty positions if they happen to have a spouse in the same institute, regardless of their merit. There's so many things like that.
Or you have a powerful supervisor and they have said something to you, but how to approach that, because it's a big hush issue, right? If I go on and complain against any male supervisor or female supervisor, it could be anyone, I will be terrified. I will be scared, honestly. Like I don't want to make it a big deal. I don't want to become like labeled as a difficult woman to work with. And like how to cope up with that? What is the limit?
So are you talking about being discouraged from doing science, or which particular thing were you talking about?
Any sexist remark if they make?
Ah.
Is there any?
So as an individual, I feel that it is not okay to expect individuals to fight the fight. That is completely unfair. So the only way is to do it collectively. So what I say everywhere is that equality is everybody's work. So everybody needs to chip in. If you hear a sexist remark, then people around you need to call it out. The onus shouldn't be on you to call it out. If you do, that's great, but the onus should not be on you. It should be on everybody else. So that is just one small example. So in this Hyderabad Charter for Gender Equity, one of the things we say is that, there should be moves against microaggressions, for example. Because if you take a single microaggression by person X against person Y, that will always be dismissed as, why are you making a big thing out of it? But when it keeps piling on, in fact, there was a quote that I usually show by another astrophysicist who says, discrimination is not a slap on the face. It's the slow drumbeat of everyday, lack of acknowledgement. And it's very subtle things. So the only way is for everyone to acknowledge that there is a problem, and for everyone to acknowledge that if we do this, that is, if we call out sexist remarks, if we make sure that the environment is not toxic, it is good for everybody. This is not something that is only good for some special interest group. It is good for everybody. The whole place will become a nicer place, a better environment. There will be more scientific productivity. So that realization, unfortunately, has to come. It's a long haul, sorry to say. But I fully agree that the onus should not be on the individual.
Thank you so much for the talk. I just had a little remark about the Miss thing. I just wanted to understand it a little more clearly. So I come from the suburbs of Chennai. My mother is from Kerala, and my grandfather went to presidency at the same time as Mani. When I'm at home, growing up, I've heard my parents, my grandfather, refer to a lot of teachers as Miss. And that comes from the etymology is completely different. But every time they use Miss, or even in my school, we use Miss Girija, Mislatama, so on and so forth. It is always in high regard, even though my grandfather is from 30s, 20s, and so on. They hold it in high regard. So in this context, I completely agree that there's a huge amount of discrimination. But the Miss part, do you think that might be reading into it a little too much?
It's hard to say. We also used to call all our teachers Miss so-and-so. I mean, I don't know, it would be like that, name and then teacher, or name and then maestro. In Kannada, we say maestro, which is like master. In college, in school, college, somehow I became Miss. I don't know why. So yeah, I mean, that itself is kind of benign. But the situation I'm talking about, it was very clearly a emphasis on the fact that she was single. I knew a lot of single women in the workplace. And I mean, even when I was in college, there were a few single women. At least 2 of our HODs were single women, and one of the PhD in physics. The only PhD in the whole college, in my college, was a single woman in physics. And there were 2 Roman Catholic nuns who were my professors in maths and physics, etc. So I never thought of, sort of this idea that a woman's fulfillment is only when, like, she gets married and builds a family. Whereas when I later went, like in IIT, I remember there was one woman in the physics department, and I think she was single. And it was always singled out. They were referred to as spinsters. And in the workplace also, I've heard my colleagues, I mean, well-respected colleagues saying, oh, these spinsters, they're always so difficult. I mean, so it was kind of okay to use that. And that was really horrifying for me. So I guess the balance is a delicate one, but now we are in the 21st century. Everybody accepts that, it's not okay to tag a woman in particular by her marital status. So when the thing you're talking about, it was nothing to do with marital status. We called both married women teachers and not married women teachers as Miss So-and-so.
Can I ask a question, Prajval? Ajit here.
Oh, hi. I can't
Yeah,
see.
thank you. I mean, an excellent talk about such a great personality. I have one confusion that, so Annamani, when she joined ISC for a PhD program with Raman, didn't they know at that time that she doesn't have master's degree? I mean, how did they let her join a PhD program?
So it looks like they had no problem with it.
So, but the PhD degree had to come from Madras University, is it?
Correct. So my understanding is that those days, Indian Institute of Science wasn't giving its own degrees. And so the degrees had to come from Madras. But I have to verify this. I haven't been able to verify this. I mean, I was quite stunned. Like before coming on this trip, I went to the Raman Institute library and asked for the thesis, and they produced these 2 theses, one PhD and one master's. And so then that opened this whole Pandora box for me. I haven't got clear answers, but I hope to dig around and maybe somebody has the answer.
That suggestion of giving her PhD now is an excellent suggestion. There is no question about that.
Oh, you think so? Oh, good. Okay.
One should make a very strong effort for that.
Okay.
No, I mean, it's a historical wrong. It's a terrible historical wrong, and I think it will
Yeah.
be. I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great.
I mean, it looks she was incredibly bold person. This probably is also responsible. From a spectroscopy study, she changes to meteorological studies, climate studies, which is quite a different change, area. How did she make that change?
I think she was very versatile that way. So even when she started out, there is some reference somewhere that she actually wanted to study medicine, but then she did better in physics, and so she chose physics or something like that. There is that story as well. And the climate science definitely drew upon all her scientific abilities and analytical skills and everything. It was scholarship driven. So she didn't get a scholarship in physics, apparently.
Okay.
So she got a scholarship in this other field, and so she decided to take it. Okay. She probably wanted to get out of here and experience.
Very broad things, knowledge anyway in science.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you.
Hi, Prajval. Thanks for a great talk. I understand your comment about not highlighting Professor Mani's gender when she was promoted to head of a department, 100+ people who happened to be men. But as you mentioned, given the climate of the time then and perhaps even now, where merit alone might be a singular criteria, isn't the mention of the genders at that statement significant to highlight the systematic gender bias in the backdrop of which she rose to the top?
See, I think it is a bit of a subtle thing. When I read this, I really cringed, I have to say. Because, so suppose they had said that Annamani rose to whatever that position was, director of this thing due to her outstanding achievements. And then if they had remarked that it might be noted that in the department, she was the only woman scientist, then it would have been a little different. Whereas here, the fact that she somehow herded these 121 men into work seemed to be some sort of, achievement, which is what I had a problem with.
Yeah, I also agree. Like sometimes some people use some words like it's the achievement. They could have said that she is the first woman in that field. This kind of things. Instead of that, they use such a word like queen bee and this kind of things, which really I considered also a sexist comment on.
Yeah.
And regarding Anand's question, my question is: if you met any male teacher, did you call them Mr. That or Mr. That? No, right? So in that case, I just feel like it is not my. It is my personal feeling that when you met, like it was happening before, but now we are in 21st century. So we should not teach our children or next generation to call anyone as Miss. Call teachers. With name teacher, I feel it's more respect.
Yes.
If someone came and say Sushmita teacher or only teacher, not saying or by my name even.
And actually, there's another subtle point to it, which someone pointed out, a student of mine with whom I was doing a course on science practice and gender inequity and all that. And so they said that now, so all your teachers are called sir and madam. And I find that very almost offensive. I mean, I know that's the practice and I know it's not the fault of the students that they're calling me madam, but I find it offensive because it is identifying me simply by my gender and nothing else, right? I would rather they call me by my name. I have a name. But if it's uncomfortable for them, they're young and I'm gray haired and whatever, then they should say professor, they should not say madam and sir. And this student in this class, she pointed out another angle to it. She said, when we are made to call our professors as sir and madam, there is a certain very strong hierarchy that is implied, and that discourages questioning. It discourages open dialogue and discussion. So she says, she was suggesting, why can't it be something more benign that we call our teachers and professors Akka, Anna, and, that kind of thing, which is a little less hierarchical, and that would facilitate more scientific thinking. Because right now, questioning from a scientific thinking point of view is conflated with questioning authority, which is like really bad.
And respect is nothing in calling, right? Respect is showing.
Yeah.
So in the context of whatever this discussion was, I understand it in the university level, calling a male or female professor or teacher. But this thing gets imbibed in us from school level. Say in prep, nursery, from that level, we call either ma'am or sir or miss or sir. So when we grow up, of course, when we start understanding things, then it might be different. But in school and mostly in all of the national level colleges also, this thing is very common. And standing in the boys line or girls line is also common. So do you think there should be like a something, and even say you are calling Akka and Anna, that is also gender biased, right? But you can't just say that I understand about hierarchy, but in that sense also it is, of course, you can't expect a 5-year-old boy or a girl calling by name of a teacher, right? I understand that no, but it might be acceptable for you that if someone calls you Sushmita, it's fine to you. But it might be that some XYZ person doesn't like that. It's for respect for that person, right? You just can't call, for example, say some old person who is teaching me, just who is 60-year-old, and I am just 5-year-old kid in a class 1. I can't just call him Ajit, right? I have to call sir.
So I think that was what this student of mine was implying, that, Akka Anna is very cultural. And so it is a slightly benign, medium step to So it is definitely, and I agree that it is the sense of it, when you're embedded in the culture, the sense of it, you call somebody Akka is different from if you call sir and madam.
Like, are able to call someone older than you by their first name, and that isn't a sign of disrespect. Because right now it's just accepted that calling someone elder to you by their first name is disrespectful. But if that changes, then calling someone by their first name doesn't imply disrespect.
Yeah, we can just say, we can try to change. We are not sure it will change or not. But if we make small step, that is also a progress, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I was horrified to learn. So I've been to a girls' school, girls' college. I didn't experience this, but I was horrified when I was told that nowadays in schools, girls and boys, that I've noticed, girls and boys are segregated on two sides of the class or whatever. But if a boy misbehaves, so-called, he's punished by making him sit with a girl. I was aghast at this. I mean, it's bad enough that, you segregate. On top of that, if you're going to see this as how to punish somebody. So I think those things are much more important to change compared to, whether we call the teacher as Miss or Akarna or whatever.
So I have heard this I've experienced it personally also and heard it from others also. In, say, for example, when a student is coming for a project or a PhD, often it happens that especially male professors ask that, and it only happens if the student is female, that if you have any plans of getting married soon or not, then only you can join the project, as if after marriage your life is over or something like that. But it is also that I have seen for the same professor, when I have questioned back that why are you not asking this to the male people? Because they have experienced such thing from a female student previously, who after marriage has not continued the project or has doomed the project. So should I then blame him because of the sexist comment, or should I understand from the experience he had before?
Yeah, I think that as a faculty, we have a certain responsibility, and we are abdicating our responsibility if we do things like this. There, I'm very clear. Because individual students have so many things, right? I mean, they leave a project for marriage. Somebody may leave a project because they won the tennis championship and now they decide to go do tennis. And, there are like 1 million things which happen. Somebody's parent got cancer, so they leave a project. I mean, so to sort of single this out is wrong. They have not done any study, okay? It's not like they've done a study to see, what is the number of students we get for internships, what fraction of them go to what afterwards, and for what reason. They've not done that study. Okay, and in fact, I would say this is one of the major, you were asking how things changed and how are things better. One of the people in the audience, you were asking, this has not changed. I know my colleagues will tell a young person, stick with your passion, it's really good, it's really important to do what you're interested in and all, if that person is a man. And if the person is a woman, they will say, you have to work with, you have to know how to manage your family and do science and this and that. I've never heard anybody tell a young man, you have to work hard because you have to manage a family. Never. So this, I think, has to be changed. And I think this will change only when institutions invest, as an emergency measure, institutions invest in gender education, equality education. It's not just gender. There are so many. Gender is very obvious. It's very easy to latch onto it. But there are so many other biases as well, which come in: caste and rural versus urban and English speaking versus not and whatnot. And so it's very, very important for institutions to invest in education, equality education of their faculty. That has to be an emergency measure.
Another thing that I would like to point out, very different from the school and the other conversations that we have been having, is that there's this general perception that women in leadership, even at high places of leadership like deans or CEOs and stuff like that, there's this perception that they have less to contribute, like even in board meetings and stuff like that. And in fact, but if you actually look at the research that has gone in, apart from, of course, the fact that sometimes they are just simply not allowed to speak because the men are talking over them, they also do take their time to think through what they have to say. So the little bit of the contribution that they do make in the meetings usually is slightly more thought out and specific than generally men just talking throughout the meeting. Yeah, something like this. That's just another thing I'd like to bring to the table, because Annamani was at such a high place of leadership. I feel like I'm pretty sure she even went through people saying that she has less to contribute because of the fact that she's a woman.
Yeah, I mean, usually it's a double whammy. As this cartoon says, if you talk, then you are told you're talking too much, and so you're difficult to get along with. And and also there are these stereotypes. I've faced it a lot. Like, women are not supposed to know about computers. I have faced that a lot in my institute. That if I make a recommendation for some computer hardware or something, I would just get it. And I felt like saying, listen, I've coded for many more years than you have. Or women are not supposed to have political opinions. That's another thing. And there's a very nice experience that a physicist from Harvard reports. So her name is Melissa Franklin. She's an expert. She's a particle physicist, and she was the first woman to be tenured in physics in Harvard. Once you're tenured, you go to faculty meetings, right? And then she started going to this meeting, and a well-meaning friend of hers who was a faculty came and told her, listen, let them get used to you first. Don't talk so much. Right. Yeah. So there are all these layers to that. And the only solution is gender education of the faculty and of senior managers. This is what we've been saying, because you can't expect the march of time to correct it.
Usually what happens, we are culturally,
Adding to what she said, we are culturally conditioned to take orders from men, including men. So that is why I feel that there's an issue when a woman is giving orders. And that, again, if I extrapolate it further, we can take orders from our mother. So when we again convert her into a mother figure, they tend to take her more seriously.
Right. So it becomes acceptable.
Yeah, some sort of an emotional leverage. So that is one thing I have observed. Now, if I tell one thing for a man to do it, and if my colleague who is a man who says it, there's a high probability that he'll do because the guy said it. And this is one thing. Second thing is, I wanted to ask if there are any policies against it, or if there's an institution, if there's something, issues with female candidates, PhD, or someone in research faces an issue, if there's a way to tackle it out and put her in the right place. Put her in the right place in the sense, like, to support her further.
No, there are no rules. So we've got as far as having a sexual harassment policy. That's like there was a time when sexual harassment was okay. The solution would be that the two people would be separated, which meant usually that the woman would be asked to leave the institution. So at least that, I think, wouldn't happen now. I think. And if it happens now, it has to happen under the table. It can't happen in an open fashion. Whereas when I was a PhD student, I have known incidents where it has happened in an open fashion, and everybody thought it was okay, or 90% of the faculty thought it was an okay thing to do. So we've got that far. So now it has to be, I think, more along the lines of education, educating senior faculty and people who are deans and directors and all of that, both men and women, because, regardless of our gender, we are all brought up to accept sexist thought and sexist action, as Bell Hooks very famously said. So all of us need to go through equality education at the senior level, so that then things can trickle down, because many of these policies have to be very institution dependent. It can't be something you prescribe from top. It has to come from the institution, taking into account the details of how that particular institution is, what is the range of people there, what kind of work goes on there. Is it mostly teaching? Is it mostly research, etc.?
Yeah, Prajval, fantastic talk and very pertinent discussions. I just wanted to make a comment first when, we were discussing the point raised by Mayu Rao, that, even now, the achievements of women are undermined. And if you get an award or, some fellowship, then it will always be said, oh, because she is a woman. So that still continues.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question that, as you said, and we have read that Annamani had a very, no nonsense attitude, and she never bothered much about, like she was very, so to say, gender neutral in that sense, in her attitude. But did she ever, complain, or did she ever raise any issue about the discrimination she faced, or she was like just
No, it was quite the opposite. She always denied that her gender had any impact on her work or anything. She constantly affirmed that there was no discrimination. It was only when Abhasur started to interview her. So Abhasur has written this very interesting book called Dispersed Radiance. I think you people should get it in your library. It's called Dispersed Radiance, Caste, Gender, and Modern Science in India. It's one of the few studies which has looked at the dimensions of caste and gender in Indian science. And she talks about, so she has interviewed Annamani extensively, and over the period of that interview, Annamani starts to acknowledge that, yes. So the point is this, that, I mean, even I would say these things when I was younger, that I have not faced any gender discrimination. So the point is, there are two things here. Firstly, somebody like me came with a huge cultural capital when I started out in science. I had educated parents, very progressive parents. I had books all around me when I grew up, and this, that, and the other. Right. So I think Annamani was similar, as I pointed out. And so then it gives you that cultural capital to kind of survive these little things you face all the time. But there's also a difference in the sense that, yeah, my coming to science has nothing to do with, or my doing science, or my taking this science question, or choosing to go to that institute has nothing to do with my being a woman. But for everybody else around me, the fact that I'm a woman seems the most important factor in the way they behave with me. So that distinction, I think, Annamani started to make only after conversations with Abhasur and all that.
I would like to thank Prajval again for this nice discussion and for this very inspiring talk. And thank you, everyone.